and welcome to the 6th edition of Web Chats, a series of virtual events for alumni and friends of the Webb School. My name is Jonathan Hawkins, Webb's Associate Director of Alumni and Development, and it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight as we continue our Webb Book Club. We are listening in to a conversation this evening about Famous in Cedarville by Erica Wright, a book the New York Times Book Review called A Clever Little Whodunit. First, though, let me introduce you to Webb's senior English teacher, Kevin Finn. Kevin has a Master of Arts in Teaching from Binghamton University and enjoys anything outside, from biking and hiking to climbing. He says inside is fine too, though, as long as it involves movies or books. And our special guest is Webb alumna Erica Wright from the class of 1999. Erica graduated from New York University and Columbia University and is the author of 4 novels and numerous poetry and essay collections. She is the poetry editor and a senior editor of Guernica magazine and teaches at Bellevue University. Erica grew up in Wartrace, Tennessee, and now lives in Washington, D.C. with her family. During this webinar, we certainly encourage questions, so please feel free to type your comments into the Q&A or chat, and we will do our best to answer them. My colleague, Kristen Linton, and I will be behind the scenes helping to get those questions answered. Now, without further ado, I am pleased to hand it off to Kevin and to welcome you both to our web chat series. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Erica, as I was saying before, we had a moment to chat before this. I'm so excited to be here with you tonight. It's a really interesting opportunity for me because I spend so much time asking my senior English students, what is it that you think the writer intended this particular passage in this particular moment? And so having that opportunity to, to chat with you and say, so what is it that you intended sort of in this moment? And I'm really actually excited to talk with them about that tomorrow as well. And gosh, what a wonderful read, just I think a perfect choice for us to be talking about right now. Here it is, late October, and for those of us in Bell Buckle, and I was talking to Erica and I was talking to you about, I'm broadcasting here from the big room, just the absolute perfect weather for discussing, a novel like this. So I have to confess, Erica, I was digging around a bit in your biography. And so I think just for us to kind of get to know one another a bit more, I found we have our ships, just as gets mentioned in the book, our ships too may have passed in the night, like Samson and Barbara. So I found a piece that you had written in the Mystery Tribune talking about the Mutter Museum. And so my connection to the Mutter Museum, and I will throw it over to you to talk a little bit about it and maybe tell us a little bit about your interest in the kind of macabre and how it informs your writing. But I actually used to live across the street from the Mutter Museum. I worked in Philadelphia. I taught at the University of the Arts, and my first apartment was actually right across the street. So I celebrated my birthday at the Mutter Museum. And for those of you listening out there, Erica had written this wonderful piece talking about this Museum of Medical Oddities as a possibility for A, your wedding reception, and B, maybe a Valentine's get-together. So with that, your fascination with kind of the Mutter Museum, and I guess I was just curious as I was reading this, where, kind of at what moment, was it at Webb, was it prior to that, that I think your fascination with, with the macabre began?
Well, I have to say I'm quite jealous that you lived across from the Mutter Museum. I've only been there once, and it's been a decade ago. So I wrote this sort of love letter to this strange institution in Philadelphia. For anyone who doesn't know, it was originally a teaching institution. So in the late 1800s, medical students would go to learn about, tumors and eye disease and things like that. But they have all of these macabre treasures, let's call them, on display, and sort of the history of medical history. So, but I will say, lest anyone's thinking that it's a very dark place. It's a beautiful building, though. It really would be a nice place for a wedding reception.
For sure, yeah.
But it's we think about the Southern Gothic as a literary tradition, but I never knew that growing up in Wartrace, Tennessee. But I think it's sunk into my bones somehow anyway. So every summer I remember just being let loose to kind of romp around, in this sort of rural life. I would spend all day in the creek making up stories. I was convinced that there was some sort of supernatural creature, out there, and was hunting it. So without any kind of prompting and any reading, this is what I was drawn to from a quite early age. And then as I got older, teachers were very quick to say, oh, here's some Edgar Allan Poe. I think this will be up your alley. And it was. So yeah, I think there is something just about the landscape of the South, the dramatic landscape. You were talking about that storm kind of rolling in. It gets into your, it gets into your guts a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. So next week, I'm going to be teaching a rose for Emily to my seniors, to my AP group. And as I was reading the opening of the novel, and I'm wondering if you'd like maybe even to share a section of the opening with our audience, but I could not help but think of Emily Grierson, right? That moment in Faulkner's story. So we have this wonderful, again, the Victorian house, and the woman who is revered by the town, but is this mystery, right? And what's been going on in that house. And I couldn't help but think of Barbara Lace. And so this is one of those moments for you, if perhaps that was an inspiration in part, or if it is really in some ways, as you said, just sort of in the air as a Southern writer.
That's a good question. I wouldn't say I was, directly influenced by Faulkner. First of all, I don't think I would presume to say that. But you do bring up a, an interesting point about not just the landscape, but also the architecture of the South. So much of it is, especially in areas that are not booming, that are not kind of enjoying this real estate boom, you do see these beautiful old kind of bones of houses. So the house itself is either uninhabitable or close to it, but they're beautiful, and there's a sort of lovely kind of juxtaposition, and I wanted to kind of emphasize that as well, this idea that just because something is decayed doesn't mean that it's no longer beautiful. And I think Barbara Lace was kind of the character of Barbara Lace. For those of you who haven't read the book, is this sort of aging silver screen actress. And she was ambitious kind of her whole life. Unfortunately, she's dead in the very first scene, but we see her in other parts of the book, and we see her kind of fighting against this notion that you have to be kind of young and perky to be kind of a value. And so you kind of reflect in the house as well, I think.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting for me, thinking about, and I'm curious, and I would love to get to this later as well, just the choice of Samson's profession. So he is our kind of reluctant detective, the detective by necessity. And I'm really curious to ask some more questions about that as well. But if you saw a link between that idea of the unearthing, the recovering of beauty, and this person who restores for a living is ultimately what he does, these reclamation projects.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he was very loosely based on a real person that I knew in War Trace, who died too early and was kind of just a larger than life figure. So a lot of the people in small towns have these kind of these kind of big personalities, and he was someone who was just kind of just always personal, always charming would be the word that I would use. And it was sort of reflected in his work. So he was an antiques restorer as well. And I thought, what a kind of interesting juxtaposition. You have this person who seems to really love life, and then he's trying to restore these objects. So I was really interested in that idea of Samson as kind of a main character. It's definitely inspired by rather than based on, but some of the kind of career details are similar.
Yeah, so interesting. I was thinking as well, and I guess that idea of the in your other fiction, the Catstone series. It seems like and I'm afraid I haven't read those novels yet, but I'm very interested now in going further, into your work. But thinking about the contrast, to my understanding is that she may be a more traditional kind of dyed-in-the-wool detective or private investigator, whereas Samson is thrown into this by necessity. He's sort of our Hamlet of, I've oh cursed spite that I was born to set this right. Would you say that's an accurate assessment? That how did you think about those characters in relationship to one another?
Yeah, absolutely. So Kat Stone's a professional. She's very good at her job. And Samson is not. Samson does he's never
Right.
done this before. And he gets kind of dragged into it, as you say, reluctantly. But he's interested from the beginning. So, I think that for to start with, he wants to see inside this old house. So
Right.
he's very curious. He's there for a very macabre reason. So he's there with these other men to extract the body at the very beginning of the book, but he's kind of a little interested to see inside this old mansion of this, kind of retired silver screen actress. So he's reluctant, but there's a spark of curiosity that I kind of pulled from the beginning. And then, as they say, their kind of ships have passed in the night. So he does have a connection. But everyone in the town does, which is another thing I wanted to explore. I was thinking a little bit about so after you might know this, but after J.D. Salinger published The Catcher in the Rye, he was a rock star. He was wildly famous, especially for a writer. So he didn't retire from writing. He retired from life basically and became a recluse in this small town. And he was notorious for sort of giving journalists the runaround. So, journalists would come up, they would try to get these Salinger stories, and the people of the small town would just kind of close ranks in a way that's possible if you are in a town of 400 or 500 people. So I also thought, oof, what this added kind of difficulty of investigating a murder if, you have kind of a team, right? You sort of the townspeople can kind of work together, even if they have their own, rivalries and things outside of this big mission. I
Yeah.
can't remember the original question. I've
Oh, I
diverted
know.
into I've diverted into Salinger.
Yeah, no, it's fine. And thinking about those reclusive figures and sort of the joke of Pynchon as well, just who is he? And so we get that really interesting sense of, as you said, the closed ranks, and also too that sort of we're rooting for the home team here, to some extent. And so it's Bishop that folks maybe want to win, and even though to some extent Samson is an outsider, he's been there long enough to qualify, whereas Agent McKinnell is not. And is that so? Your experience in War Trace growing up, did you find that very much to be the case? And I think about Tennessee and how it's changed in my time here. And I'm a transplant. I've only been here for 11 years, but just the way in which it has changed. And I guess to some extent, I may be nativized having been here 11 years, but I wonder, in War Trace when you were growing up, what that was like, your experience with those folks, of how ranks were closed and how outsiders were perceived. Were there McKinnells?
I don't remember any outsiders.
Oh, okay.
That's such a good question. I'm trying to think. It's a town of 500 people. I made it a little bigger in the novel for a few kind of practical reasons. One, I wanted there to be a restaurant that actually stayed open so that people could go and gossip. We would always have these great restaurants in War Trace, delicious food, and they just wouldn't make it because it doesn't have the visitors, unfortunately, like Bell Buckle does. My understanding is actually there's a very nice cafe there now, but I have not visited yet. So if anyone's in the Bell Buckle area, maybe just it's just a few miles the way the crow flies, go check out War Trace for me in the new cafe. But when you're in a place like that, and actually Webb is the same way, you really do at least know everyone passingly, right? So maybe you're not intimately familiar with everyone, but that at Webb, that person plays on the soccer team, and that person gave a really great declamation. That person's good at English. All these details somehow, almost as if you've just kind of absorbed them because you are such kind of a small community. And it's the same in a small town. You sort of, you at least have a passing familiarity with everyone, and it creates a unique ecosystem and a really fun place to set a mystery. And there are a lot. I love cozy mysteries. This is not a cozy mystery, but it's still using some of those. I'm taking kind of some of the best parts of those kind of small town mysteries where there's a lot of gossip, a lot of insider knowledge, and the trick is to sort of get the right people talking.
Yeah, and so interesting because we have this moment, and it's interesting as I was thinking about preparing for this, of how to avoid spoilers, because my gosh, there's some delicious ones in this. But part of the novel takes place in Los Angeles as well. And again, when I was thinking of that idea of the lineage, Samson's literary predecessors, but also, I mean, just this wonderful tradition of the detective novel set in Los Angeles, and that meeting of small town and Hollywood. So again, I have a number of questions I was thinking about on this, but I guess I'm curious, the Los Angeles element, you spent time there and researching for the novel, or?
Well, I will say I did not want the book to go anywhere except for Cedarville. I had the title early on, Famous in Cedarville. This is going to be a Cedarville novel. It's going to be my kind of love letter to War Trace. So I wrote a love letter to the Mutter Museum. So this is going to be my love letter to War Trace. And then the story just kept really pulling me hard towards Los Angeles. And I thought, well, I'm not sure if I can write about this, kind of formerly successful actress, this working actress in kind of the golden era of Hollywood without actually taking us there. So it's set in 2003, and sort of getting Los Angeles in 2003 right was probably the hardest part of the book. There's a really kind of lovely, although massive book called City of Quartz that is kind of divides Los Angeles into these different power groups, which I found very helpful. So the way that the real estate industry came to power in Los Angeles, Hollywood, kind of the mafia, so all these different kind of elements. And that was incredibly helpful for kind of situating the book. And then for the more kind of pop culture things, I look at old kind of magazines of People magazine and things like that to sort of see, what did Los Angeles look like in 2003. I have visited Los Angeles, but not in that particular year, not in that particular era. So that was definitely my biggest challenge of writing the book was Los Angeles, and I was very resistant to it. I did not want the novel to go there, but it did, and it was fun in the end.
Did you feel, did you feel the ghost of Philip Marlowe, right? That sort of great lesson. And I was thinking about, I had this, and it's probably silly, and please tell me that it is, but I was thinking, oh, Samson is he's a soft-boiled detective or something, right?
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Soft-boiled detective.
You mentioned that he would be gritty elsewhere, but they describe him as a little womanly in this small southern town, but he's got that. We see there's a bit of a fighter in him, as there was, I guess, in Philip Marlowe, but also that sensitive side as well. He's a guy who takes the spiders outside, and for that I love Samson dearly, because that is me as well. So I don't know. I guess I was just curious of thinking of that tradition of those great detectives. If there was a bit of, once you get to Los Angeles, do you have to contend with the specters of these other figures?
Absolutely. And I think that is another reason why I didn't really want to write an LA. I didn't want to write an LA novel because the LA noir tradition is one that I love, but it's not one that I'm wedded to. For me, I love James Ellroy. I think his books are brilliant. And so, LA Confidential is kind of in the back of my head. And I consider that sort of an epic novel, regardless of genre. It is always kind of classified with the mysteries, but it's almost kind of a postmodern look at this city, this kind of the underbelly of the city, very much the underbelly. So yeah, that's definitely haunted me as I move the book out there. But I love the term soft-boiled detective. Yeah, Samson is a little bit soft-boiled, so it's fun to sort of put him back in LA as well, where he's definitely out of his depths.
Right.
Fast.
Right.
Yeah. He's wearing the wrong shoes. He's just, not ready.
The airport moment, and I've thought about it. That moment. For those of you, if you have not read, Samson, when he's taking this trip, he buys a new pair of shoes at the airport. And I thought, every time I see those stores, I think, well, who's buying those shoes? It's Samson, Delaware. Yeah. Now we know that we have our answer,
right?
Which was I thought wonderful. Okay, so I guess, connected to that, and I'm hoping we'll have a chance to loop back around to Los Angeles and setting, and that's why. But I guess I was thinking about your trajectory as well, from War Trace, I understand, to New York City, and that idea of movement. Again, that image that you used in the novel of these ships that are passing, and Samson trying to find his way in this town that he's come to. And Barbara, that parallel of her trying to find, she reached escape velocity and she's out. I guess what I was thinking as I was reading this is did you identify, or maybe project upon, or is she an avatar of? Is there a bit of Barbara, a bit of you in Barbara, or maybe even in Samson? I guess I was just thinking about the parallels in that way in your lives.
Well, there's a little bit. I think that 18-year-old Erica was kind of foolhardy in the same way that 18-year-old Barbara Lace was, just ready to get out of this small town. As you can hopefully tell from my answers here, I love Wartrace. I still do. It's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful place to grow up. But I definitely was itching for something bigger. And New York City was as big as I could get. So, that's where I went, and Barbara Lace, made her way to Los Angeles or to Hollywood. And so that part, the kind of being foolhardy at 18 and thinking, I'm going to go get lost in this big city for sure. A little bit of Barbara Lace, and I like this kind of. One thing I did tap into. I definitely remember when I was a senior at Webb and was accepted to NYU. That's where I was going. Several people from Wartrace said, they would be like, "Oh, you'll be back in a couple of weeks, so you'll be back in a couple of months." And that happened pretty routinely, and so I kind of inserted that a little bit with Barbara Lace, where they're at first they're just like, "Oh, she'll just turn up back here," and then this didn't happen to me, thankfully, but then they get a little morbid about it. So the people of Cedarville think, she's got what she deserved. We haven't heard from her in months. She must have come to a bad end out there, and then she shows up in a movie, and they're all back on her side. So that was kind of fun to play with, a little bit of light revenge on the people who said I'd be back in 2 weeks.
Those moments of again, when we can that ultimately are sort of jealousies, the way they kind of inhibit, but then that moment of, okay, well, you've made it, so I guess we can, again, you maybe transcend it, and now we can root for you. Gosh, I love that detail. I think was it like 72 days later, and as if they were kind of marking off on the calendar of, we haven't heard from her, we haven't seen, and that was the moment she appears with, is it with Bogart?
It's a sort of a riff, a riff on Bogart, I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah. As more or less an extra. She has one line, but one line is a big deal.
Right. And it's interesting, thinking about that. So you'd mentioned this early on, and I guess looping back to it, the idea of how to sustain a career as a woman in Hollywood, and just in some ways that she was so successful in doing that. And again, were there? I guess I'm curious about your research in general, but if there were particular figures that she is inspired by, both historically within her era, but also right now in this moment.
Well, there was an actress, a very successful actress from Shelbyville, Tennessee, whose name was Sandra Locke. Sandra Locke. So her very first movie was, I believe, in the 60s. It was the Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Do I have that title right? The
Carson McCullers.
Carson McCullers books, and she was nominated for an Academy Award. It was her very first role. So she was immediately famous. She was linked with Clint Eastwood for many years romantically. She made a string of very successful movies. She's not a name you hear much anymore. Which is also interesting, because she was as successful as you can get in this industry, and then she was forgotten. So I did like that idea. So she wasn't necessarily, so Barbara Lace is not necessarily based on Sandra Locke. It's a slightly different era, and very different. I don't know much about Sandra Locke's personality, so Barbara Lace is entirely made up. But this idea of someone kind of being at the pinnacle of their career, skyrocketing to success, and in this fickle industry can be sort of forgotten, or remembered as Clint Eastwood's girlfriend, which is something that comes up a lot. So that kind of stuck in my craw a little bit, and I wanted to give Barbara Lace a little more agency. Although, of course, Locke, in my imagining, Locke was probably more successful, Academy Award nominations and things like that, and Barbara Lace is kind of fighting the whole time to be relevant and be successful.
Yeah, interesting. Do you? And I think about the other characters in the novel, and so Bridgette, who again, this source of the way in which she's complicated throughout the novel and becomes this source of strength. And so I guess, in my head, the question I was thinking for you of those characters and those transformations, which maybe you most identified with, whether it was Barbara or Bridgette or Samson, to some extent, that, in each of the paths that they walk.
Well, Bridgette was fun to write because I kind of underestimated Bridgette as well. So more than my other novels, I did kind of have a plan for this one, and I had things kind of sorted, and I had Bridgette as a character to more or less show how people interacted with Samson in this small town. So as you said, he's been there a long time, but he's not from Cedarville, so he is does still have this outsider status. He's a widow. And there aren't very many, single men of a certain age in Cedarville. So I kind of had her there in the first, few scenes. You cringe at her a little bit because she's sort of very heavily flirting with Samson, and you kind of feel for her. And then as my writing went along, and as the book goes along, she, as you say, she's actually quite complicated and interesting, and becomes very essential to the success of Samson's investigation. And I love that she surprised me as I was writing it, and I hope that was fun for the readers as well. In terms of your question about relating to the characters, I would say that's I haven't. It's funny. It seems like that would be something that I'd thought of before. I relate a lot to Cat Stone in my Cat Stone books, and I think I was trying to do something intentionally very distant from myself. So I don't necessarily relate very much to Samson, except perhaps in his fear of snakes, but also knowing that they are harmless and he doesn't want to kill them. I relate very strongly to that. I think snakes are incredibly important to our ecosystems. I think they're beautiful, and I also don't want them in my house.
But not in my backyard.
Yeah, house. If they could just mosey along, that would be good.
Okay, well, so that, and I know you have actually written a nonfiction book as well called Snake in the Object series. And so I had that rattling around in the back of my head as I was reading. And so I loved, being an animal. As I said, I am, as my students know, my room is a no-kill zone. It doesn't matter if there's a spitting cobra in the room, I'm going to find some way to get it out, as Bridgette, clearly would as well.
Yes.
But there's those wonderful, kind of speaking of those Gothic elements early on, the crows are calling, there's the sighting of a coyote in the distance, and here's the calls, and those repeated sort of images of animals in this. And I was thinking about, for you as a writer, and I noticed this in your poetry as well, that the role that the relationship between humans and animals plays in your work, whether it be in this novel or in general, because I thought what a really interesting companion piece Snake was to this, thinking solely at the level of the cover, and then of course those incidents that Samson has.
Yeah, that was kind of a lovely coincidence. They just happened to kind of be published close together, although I was working on them at very different times. But all of my books have a lot of animals in them. I think if I had taken another path in life, I would have been a zoologist. And sometimes I still kind of daydream that how nice it would be to wake up and go and work with animals all day. But there is this sort of Gothic element of the crows, and there's a saying I love, the hour between dog and wolf, which is that hour in dawn where if you see an animal on the horizon, it could be a dog, it could be a family dog, or it could be a wolf, and you can't see because it's just a sort of silhouette. And it's such kind of a lovely way to describe the danger of darkness, or the danger of that time in the wild, or in cities or wherever. There's something about that transition between night and day. There's this sort of liminal space that's very interesting and very central to kind of Gothic writing. And then the Snake book was something I desperately wanted to write. The writing, like the movie industry, the writing industry is so fickle, and I learned a long time ago not to invest very heavily in anything, not to get too emotionally involved. But I wanted to write that Snake book so badly, and I pitched the idea to the publisher, to Bloomsbury, and just kind of refresh my email, which you're not supposed to do. Do not do that. Just walk away. And then sort of every day just hoping to hear from them, and then they said, yes, I could write this kind of strange little collection of essays looking at the snake from these different angles. So that was actually a super fun project. That was the most fun I've had writing something, was definitely the Snake book.
Yeah, and I think so important too, because I think you spend so much time, right, advocating in these ways for the vilified, whether they be beings or beasts in this. And so Oh, so I've got to pick up on that, the point you had made, that, and I love that, thinking of like Bergman's Hour of the Wolf, but that the dog and wolf, how do you see that playing out in our characters when they're dogs and when they're wolves? Because for me, as soon as you said that, I thought, oh, this is really interesting, because I think, and I guess I will try not to spoil, but there were plenty of dogs who became wolves as I read, and I love that element of this.
Yeah, I think that's something I like about mystery novels in general. So, one thing I really like about mysteries is that, or thrillers, mysteries, anything kind of this noir genre, you always start with a kind of volume out of 10. So there's with a few exceptions, there's kind of a murder in the first few pages. So it's high stakes right away. Even again, if you're reading something that's kind of a cozy mystery, there's still people who are going to be devastated by this death, and that has to be kind of treated sensitively. Everyone's lives surrounding this victim are going to be disrupted. Everyone's lives surrounding the people investigating are going to be disrupted. So that's one element I really like about mysteries, is that you always know what's at stake. There's never a question of why am I being told this story, kind of right away. So I'm definitely drawn to that. And then there's this idea that because you're reading this genre of novel, you are kind of looking at every character and saying, okay, are they a dog or are they a wolf, right? Are they a suspect or are they an ally? And that can, it can change, as you say, as you're reading, you're making new discoveries, or as the characters themselves are changing and making discoveries about themselves.
Yeah. So I have to, thinking along the lines of characters now, I've got to bounce over to always my favorite character in literature, the English teacher. So Mrs. Answood, who's referred to, speaking of, she's not even a dog or wolf, she's our dragon in this. Yes. And I love some of the quest imagery that comes up later, the dragon, Barbara, there's a moment where a character says, am I just the dragon sitting on top of the gold? But was Mrs. Answood, by any chance, inspired by any of your Webb English teachers? Is she an amalgam of folks you kind of want to play, or just a pure fiction?
She was not based on any of my my Webb teachers, although I did all of my English teachers at Webb were wonderful and very encouraging. I was thinking that before this call. So I went to Webb in 7th grade. So I know you start at 6th grade now, but 7th grade is still also very young. And you're just very scared. And I had Miss Hefner as my English teacher, and right away she was just so encouraging of my writing. And so I think in retrospect, I think she was overly encouraging, because she could see how uncomfortable I was at the school and in my other classes. But I could read anything that I knew I could do. I wasn't sure about the pre-algebra, but you could give me Dostoevsky and I could get through it. So she was very encouraging. And I think I didn't want to be a writer in 7th grade. I wanted to be a zoologist. But it did set me on this path. It was a place where I could feel comfortable. It's a place where I was not, I didn't have any anxiety. I knew I could write if I was asked to write. So I was reflecting on my teachers before this call, even though they are not necessarily in the novel.
Yeah. Well, I loved her. I mean, again, she's a wonderful, at 6'2", right, imposing, and just that sort of idea of no slips in your grammar, I think, in her class. And even Callista Weathers, I thought of, I think you also mentioned as an English major, and I thought, oh, well, of course, that's where she went wrong.
Yeah, I wanted to make the women in this book fierce. It's got a male protagonist,
right?
It's his story, but the women I think they all are surprising, and they're all fierce in their own ways.
Yeah. So, and I guess that's, I was thinking about this as well, moving from Kat to Samson, who feels, as I said, to some extent, both an oddity in that he deals in antiques, but also is maybe very much sort of in that vein. And I guess it's interesting hearing you say now that in some cases you were showcasing the women around him. Do you feel a responsibility to write women in these roles where, for so much of the tradition, they have been the damsel in distress or the femme fatale, or the secretary, that erstwhile secretary manning the gumshoe's desk. Do you feel that obligation, that responsibility? Did that inform any of your decisions? I guess what called you to Samson
Sure. Well, it's funny. I was attending a mystery writers conference in Nashville, Killer Nashville, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I
great
don't know if
name.
anyone's familiar with it. Yeah, I think it's in Franklin, once a year, and it's really well run, beautiful conference. And at these conferences, I'm sure this is true for any profession. It's very easy to strike up conversations with people because you're just all in the same profession. You're all kind of very similar, have similar interests. So I was sitting next to this journalist at, for lunch. We had lunch together. He was really interesting. He had lots of questions about my teaching. We had this great conversation. And at the end, he asked me to tell him about my book. And I had just published my first Cat Stone book. So I told him about it. I was literally gathering my bags. I remember this. And he said, "Oh, good. I'm so glad that you have a woman protagonist because women can't write men." And I was so startled. I was, I sort of, immediately I'm thinking like Willa Cather's the professor. I'm thinking, this rich history of women. And then he doubled down and said, men can write women, but women can't write men. And I was so startled. I didn't really say anything. I just kind of walked away. So I definitely, when I thought about having Samson, who I loved as a character kind of right away, that in the back of my head, I was thinking, I really want to get this right. I really want to prove this man whose name I don't remember wrong with this novel.
That's fantastic, right? Sort of the finding our motivations in, and what a really interesting experience and thinking.
Yeah.
Well, way to prove them wrong.
Right. I hope so. But in terms of the fierce women characters, I like to write books that I want to read, and I typically enjoy books that have, kind of fierce characters in general, but especially fierce women. Interestingly, my latest novel, which my agent has right now, and hopefully will be a real book someday. I was kind of writing against that. So it's someone who it's a young 18-year-old protagonist whose both parents have been killed in a serpent handling church. So they both have been bitten and died. And she's very kind of wounded and meek at the beginning, but she becomes fierce. she learns along the way, along the story. So
finding her wolf.
She's finding her wolf, exactly.
Yeah. So I did want to allude to, and this was actually one of my questions as well. I believe it popped up in the chat. So, and I hope I'm getting this right, but I know my question related to that was, as you were structurally in the novel. So I loved the epigraphs. I know for me, one of my favorite novels is Watership Down, and so those, as an adolescent reading those epigraphs of these sort of works, but the chapter epigraph that you use, these snippets of newspapers, of tabloid clippings, and in particular those screenplays. I guess I'm curious about the genesis of that idea came from, and I'm really curious actually too about which of those was your favorite. I was thinking, like, if you could produce one of those screenplays or pursue a novel, which would it be? I have one in particular that was a favorite of mine, but
Well, it's interesting. I have an English degree from NYU, but I double majored in something called dramatic literature, which is a completely useless major. I shouldn't say that. Someone might be majoring in it right now. It's not. It's great for people going into theater. I was not, though. I just loved the classes. So I was looking at the class list. I knew I wanted to be an English major, but I wanted to take all of these kind of interesting kind of classes on screenplay writing, on cinematography. It's basically the study of any kind of drama writing. So it would be plays as well as screenplays, musicals, all of these things. So I had a lot of useless knowledge in my head. and I thought, maybe I can finally, after, 15 years, put this to some use. And so I did kind of write some of these a little bit modeling after kind of some of my favorite movies. And Hitchcock, old kind of Hitchcock. To Catch a Thief is one of my favorites. So that was kind of heavily drawing on To Catch a Thief. So I think my favorite's just the first one, and I'm looking at it right now because I forget the name of it. Which is probably for Midnight Millionaire, this kind of very early 1939 movie, and I just like the sort of the cadence of the way that movies in the 1930s and 40s were written. So they did have a bit of poetry to them as opposed to realism, and this sort of hyper dialect, this kind of invented actually Midwestern American dialect that everyone spoke in.
Right.
that was really fun to write and play around with. And then of course, it sort of moves into the 70s, you get a little bit more realistic, and those are their own sort of challenge. But the earlier ones were fun for me to write.
Yeah. There was one in particular for me, and it invoked, there was an Audrey Hepburn film where she is blind, and I'm blanking,
Oh,
but
right. Yeah. Mhm.
but you had one where there's a man perched, and he's watching a blind seamstress, and I thought, oh gosh, I want to watch this movie. So I think this were really a blast as well to explore. I have just some random minutia, and I was just, this is my moment. Okay, so I
hope I remember.
So Antimacassar, I have only encountered that word in one other story, and I asked a friend, sort of practice. I'm like, do you know this word? So when I was, when I've taught the monkey's paw in the past, it mentions an Antimacassar, and I have to confess, the first time that I'm sure when I read it as a student, I glossed over that. When I was teaching, you thought, I've got to know this word. And I thought, what a fascinating word, and thinking about hair oils and they would have been used. Mm-hmm. So I was delighted. I mean, for someone who loves words, I thought, Antimacassar, I know what it is. So I don't know, I guess I'm just curious of where that came from. Was it part of Samson's, again, just of course, Samson would identify an Antimacassar, it's what he does. Did it grow out of some of your research with him, or was it somewhere in the back of your mind you were channeling the monkey's paw? I don't know, just pure curiosity and maybe selfish in some way.
No, I love it. No, I learned that word from a poetry teacher of mine, Lucy Brock-Broido. She would use the word Antimacassar, which I think that people listening might already know, or you might know from context clues, was sort of a usually very beautiful kind of lace or embroidered kind of fabric that would go over the back of the couch to keep the hair oils from damaging the fabric of the sofa. So then I thought, it's kind of a word that you can't really throw around lightly, but Samson would know it. I think that Samson would know that word from his career. So I thought, let's do a little we'll do a little homage to Lucy Brock-Broido as Antimacassar.
Yeah, wonderful. And I guess my second moment, and they're actually two kind of related in this. So I guess I'll cut to this one next. So it's mentioned, of course, we can't talk about Wartrace or Cedarville without the train. It's the train station that brings Samson there, originally his restoration project. But there was a wonderful line when he's stuck behind the train. And I think of this fondly because there was a moment last year that I was teaching and I was stuck waiting to get to class, and a student emailed me. It popped up on my phone. Of course, I was browsing. She said, Mr. Finn, I'm so sorry. I'm going to be late for class. I'm stuck behind the train. And I said, Olivia, I'm 2 cars in front of you. And so, but it said that in Cedarville, a perfectly valid excuse for being late is being stuck behind the train. Erica, did you ever use that excuse when you were at Webb?
Not falsely, but I was late often because of the train, because I was a day student, of course, from Wartrace. So, driving over, you could get stuck for quite a long time. And one thing that was a bit challenging in the novel is that that's definitely a very regional experience. And so I was thinking, are other people going to know what I'm talking about, even that, you can get stuck for 15, 20 minutes and people, they get out of their trucks, they get out of their cars, you chat, you catch up, you ask about people's mamas, and you check in about the weather, and then you get back in your car. And it's such a very, very regional thing, but was of course normal growing up. And then you move away and you think, oh, that's actually kind of odd. That's actually a little bit odd. Yeah. Although there must be parallels. There must be kind of people who live with drawbridges and things, and oh, I miss the bridge, and now I've got to wait.
Right. I feel like that feels like rich material for a future novel, right? The moment hinging kind of literally and figuratively on the drawbridge opening and closing.
Yeah.
Okay, and so last on just my sort of foray into, so Bridgette brings, again, kind of looping back to animals here, it's an Irish setter that she brings. And for me, again, so as a kid, I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania. There were a series of novels that were written in Pennsylvania in the 40s, sort of the precursor to Old Yeller and even Where the Red Fern Grows, called Big Red. By any chance, and it's the only other time that I've encountered Irish setters in fiction. And so just pure curiosity for me of, what was the Irish setter? Was it something you encountered in Wartrace growing up, or I don't know, just curiosity, or those novels.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those novels. I wish I were. It would be a nice way to bring this in conversation to a close. But no, I like the idea of, because Bridgette, as I mentioned, she becomes very, she's quite surprising. So, she has this job at the utilities office, and then we kind of discover her love of animals, and, how, I think that kind of informs her, the compassionate side of her personality, as well as she's very practical. She's a very kind of practical person. She, as you say, she would be someone who would just scoop up the snake from the kitchen and take it outside, and it wouldn't be a whole production. But yeah, I don't quite remember why I chose the Irish Setter. I wanted her to be, for her to be breeding the dogs, because that was something that happened in war trades. People would breed, full-blooded animals usually for extra money, but it was done in a not really as a business, just sort of kind of occasionally. And so that was something I was bringing into the story as well. And then I like this idea of this little Irish Setter puppy showing up in Samson's life. Well, at the absolute worst time, he can't take care of a puppy. Yeah.
So, and I'm not sure if this is, do you see, is this a standalone novel, or is there any possibility of revisiting Samson and River the puppy? And I'll say no more beyond that.
Right.
Or do you see has it run its course?
I think that it's run its course for me. I really do like Samson as a character. So I could imagine him maybe being a kind of a subplot character in a novel. I could go on I don't know if you're familiar with Tana French's wonderful Murder Squad books, but it's a series, but every book is about a different detective in the Dublin Murder Squad. And so I could see Samson kind of showing up in another book, but I think I told his story in this one.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I'm gonna head back over to the someone else in message. Do you cast your characters with actors or people that you know?
I not while I'm writing. I do see them very clearly, and I can still see Samson. I do the best I can to sort of render them, but I'm sure what readers see is different than what I see. I did do one of those blog posts where you sort of cast the movie, which is fun to think about. And I said David Tennant for Samson was what would see my sort of dream cast for that role. And then I see kind of Glenn Close as Barbara Lace in the flashback scenes. So
right. In terms of the film research, and did you go down that rabbit hole of I have to watch, some classic cinema? There was that moment early on when I believe it's Callista says something to the effect, I want to be left alone. And I had that kind of Garbo moment. Were you spending a lot of time, were you really steeped in film as you were writing this, or was it just recollections?
It was mostly recollections. So, growing up, I watched a lot of AMC and Turner Classic movies. So I'd stay up way too late after finishing my homework, of course. And I would watch these movies. We also very briefly in War Trace, and I've written about this because this is such an oddity. We did have our own kind of local movie rental place. It was 2 tiny rooms. And it was basically just this woman's own collection of VHS tapes, but she kind of opened this little shop in downtown War Trace. So on Friday afternoons, when I would leave Webb, I would stop there and just kind of stock up for the weekend. So I had all these wonderful movies that I would watch and rewatch, because it's not like now when you go to the next thing in Netflix, you've got your movies for the weekend, or you've got your AMC. And then I did have this degree at NYU, so I watched a sort of fair number of the classics in a sort of academic environment, which is not the best way to watch classics, but was fun at the time.
Do you feel, so when you say that, are they too anatomized then, right? We murder to dissect. Does it feel some of the essence is lost in that dissection?
It's funny because I love doing that for books. I was very, all of my English classes were delightful, but I was not planning on making a career in screenwriting or a career in directing. So I'm sure my classmates loved it. So this idea of, spending 30 minutes discussing why this was shot from outside the window versus inside the window, which I would love to do again. If you want to, we could do it for, for a novel. And I would be very excited about it, but I wasn't ready, I think, for that level of film analysis. But I have it; it's in my brain.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. So speaking of, film, then, our Samson, he watches the credits to movies, which again, all the things that I love about Samson, taking the spiders outside. Do you watch the credits to movies?
Usually I do, yes. I have a 11-month-old, so I don't remember the last time I watched a movie, but in the pre-life, yeah, I do. I'm fascinated. All the names scrolling by, if you watch enough movies, you start to see, oh, that's the same costume designer that was used on that film. I'm often interested in who's doing the score. And then, I love the sort of, when they thank the locations, they thank the people, such and such restaurant or such and such town. To me, that's really interesting because we think of so many things as being, and so many things are just filmed on sets. So I'm always fascinated whenever they're thinking kind of real locations and real kind of people in those locations.
Yeah,
Stumbling over my words a little bit, but yeah, no, I do watch the credits at the end for a good movie. If I haven't enjoyed it, I will bail. But
that seems fair. So and this may seem like an odd question, but I was kind of thinking, what would be those? So if this is our southern, our homage to War Trace, what would be, if this was a southern dish, if this novel was a southern dish, what would it be? And help a Yankee like me to understand. And again, feel free to gloss over that question if it's just too preposterous. But
no, I like it. It's funny because the bookstore asked me that as well.
Okay.
Fountain Bookshop in Richmond, Virginia. This beautiful, lovely bookshop that I hope you all will visit if you're ever in Richmond. They do snacks with their book events, and so they asked me, for a food recommendation, and I struggled with it. Thankfully, it was over email, and I can't remember what I said. And now I'm struggling even now. I think it would be some sort of casserole though, like a hash brown casserole, because it's got that sharpness, that kind of sour cream sharpness coming through.
Right.
But nice kind of potatoes, sort of salt of the earth, but also some nice cheese. Some nice deliciousness.
I
like
love
that.
it.
Yeah.
I'll go with
it.
Something they brought to Samson, one of the many widowers in town brought to Samson, right? And then he has his dishes with the Post-it notes on them marking at some point there was a casserole there.
Yeah, for sure. He got a lot of casseroles. As the young widower of Cedarville.
So another question here. From the board, could you talk a bit about the difference in writing process and specifically editing of novels versus poetry? Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, poetry is my first love. It's what my master's degree is in poetry. So I thought I would always write poems. I didn't really have an interest in fiction. And then out of my master's program, I started teaching at John Jay College of Criminology, just teaching English classes. And so I was in front of all of these, 18-year-olds who, wanted to work for the CIA, they wanted to work for the FBI, they wanted to go undercover. And so I just started researching these different careers in order to have a better understanding of their future lives, and then became interested. I kind of got a kernel of a story, this idea of someone who has had a life kind of working undercover, is very good at it, but is, damaged from this experience of kind of pretending to be someone else for years of her very young life. And I thought, oh, I think I want to write this as a story. And that became the first, Cat Stone book. Which is to say, in answer to the excellent question, with poetry, I have kind of a lot of craft background. So I'm thinking about prosody. I'm thinking about how the line scans. I'm thinking about how the images are being used, if the metaphors are doing their job. I was just writing to someone today about the different kind of ending types for a poem, which I won't bore you with, but there's sort of 4 kind of major categories that you can kind of end a poem with. And then when I moved to prose, it was fun because I didn't have that knowledge. Of course, I'd read a lot of books, but I was really just thinking about, this is the kind of book I like to read, and that's the kind of book I'm going to try to write. So I was learning on the job a little bit. And when I read that first Cat Stone book, I can see all the flaws. But in some ways it's kind of fun. It's kind of, I can see how I was learning what I was doing. And maybe I wish it were a better book, but something about kind of the flaws are very, they're kind of dear to me in a way. And I'm hoping kind of I get a little better with every book. And then specifically the editing question, which is really great. Again, when I'm editing a poem, I often have other poets read our work. That's pretty common. You kind of exchange and get a lot of feedback. With a novel, it's a little bit more solitary because it's a big favor to ask someone to read a whole manuscript. So it has to be pretty close to done if I'm going to ask someone to do that and give me feedback. So I'm often kind of doing some pretty heavy lifting on my own and trying to make it into the best book that I can make it into before it goes to another reader, goes to my agent, or fingers crossed, an editor if someone is interested.
Yeah. And there is another question that has popped up as well. What are you reading right now that you love?
I am reading Julia Dahl's new mystery novel, The Missing Hours, which just coincidentally is actually the protagonist is an NYU student. So that's kind of just kind of an interesting parallel. I was on a bit of a Tana French kick earlier this year. If anyone has not read Tana French, she's sort of a good, I always say Tana French and Sarah Grant are two wonderful mystery writers. If you're someone who doesn't think they like mystery novels and likes kind of more serious novels, they're writing at an incredibly high level, as good as anyone out there. And then I'm reading Anjali Anjadi's book, Southbound, which is a collection of essays. She's an Atlanta writer, and she's writing these kind of wonderful personal essays about being mixed race in Atlanta, growing up in the South. She's not in Atlanta the whole time. She's in Atlanta as an adult, but growing up in the South. And that's kind of a really lovely collection. But I'm making it sound like I have a lot of time to read. Well, we'll circle back to the 11-month-old. I do read before bed, but it's sort of 30 minutes and I'm out.
Oh gosh, I'm sure. And so you said you have a novel that is, and I'm not sure if it was in the pipeline, right? So it has been finished. Is there a work now that you are you working primarily in short form? Do you find that a bit easier between juggling, the 11-month-old? Is poetry a bit easier to be working in as a mode now, or is it easier to settle into longer form? Or
it's a very good question. I don't write poetry and fiction at the same time. I find that if I'm trying to write them at the same time, they sort of bleed into each other a little bit too much. So the poems start to sound kind of too conversational for my taste. A lot of great conversational poets out there. I love Frank O'Hara, but that's not, the style I'm working in. And then the opposite happens. So, I'm writing a mystery novel. I can't spend 3 pages describing the cricket there actually is a cricket on the floor. I can't spend 3 pages describing the cricket on the floor. You got to move forward with the story. So I write them at very separate times, and I am writing mostly poetry right now since that novel is, as you say, hopefully in the pipeline. So
great.
Yeah.
And I think, and I'm not sure just in terms of time frame, I think Jonathan will prompt us if I know we are close at least, but I'm glad to keep chatting for sure. I guess maybe sort of a question to close with, thinking of seasonal sort of reads, and there are moments in this of in the Gothic tradition, but do you ever fully cross the line into kind of horror or the ghost story? Because there were flashes. We have those moments again when Callista first appears. She seems spectral. Samson is welcoming the ghost of his wife, but she never does appear. Do you see yourself? Is that a bridge you will not cross?
No, it's interesting that you identified that, because I definitely was kind of towing the line a little bit and playing with Southern ghost stories and the idea of how they are repeated. We had the Bell Witch story and things like that. So I think you can play with that idea and still keep a realistic novel, because if there are people who believe in it, they might say that they've seen a ghost, right? So that's still realism. And then in the new novel, there's a ghost. There's
okay, all
right. There's a full-fledged ghost. So I have crossed that bridge, and my agent didn't, kick me out of her roster. So hopefully, so there's definitely a pretty solid supernatural element in the new book. Although I do kind of try to toe the line a little bit, which is that maybe she's a hallucination, maybe she's a ghost, but she's there. She's definitely a character.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was wondering as I was reading those moments of, we know obviously that Samson is damaged and right, and he is hopeful and hoping to see and again welcoming these. But I think, yeah, those moments where we sort of, it becomes grounded in reality. I think those always become so interesting in films as well. So I think we actually may be at our limit here. I would love to continue talking, but this has been such a blast for me. So thank you so much for taking the time to having the patience to answer my questions. And thank you to Jonathan and Kristen as well for giving me this chance.
No, thank you. Those are excellent questions and great questions from those listening in too. Thank you so much.
Well, this has really been wonderful. Thank you both for this really wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed it, learned a lot about you, Erica. We've met before. It's always good to see you again. But and thank you to you for the overview of Famous in Cedarville. We so appreciate you spending time with us, everyone. If you haven't yet purchased a copy of this, you can do so at any of your favorite local booksellers. Next up for Web Chats, we have a conversation about Lawrence Macmillan's biography of Sonny Webb called The Schoolmaker, with longtime Webb faculty members L.R. Smith and Ron Smith. All of our Webb alumni are very familiar with The Schoolmaker, I'm sure. So join us live on Thursday, November 18th at 5:00 p.m. Central Time for this fascinating discussion about Sonny. I'll be on the lookout for that Zoom registration link soon. So that's it for tonight. Thanks again, Erica and Kevin, and everyone for joining us. We look forward to talking with you again soon. Good night, everyone.
Take care. Good night.